Today, we are going to hear about a somewhat controversial subject, quite timely, politics. And our lecturer here today, Mr. Paul Ferber, is going to kind of discuss some things, kind of shed some light on why people hate politics. Many of you may remember Paul from past lectures, and we just thought it was a good time to invite him back. Paul has taught political science at Rochester Institute of Technology since 1981. That's close to 4 decades. He specializes in political communications, state and local politics, and environmental policy. He is a former chair of the department and previously served as chair of the college's social science division. And Paul Ferber loves politics. Outside of politics, he has a passion for transportation history, with particular interest in railroad history. Other than spending part of their time on the island, Paul and his wife Peg very much enjoy traveling by rail and sea. And perhaps we might have a lecture like that. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Ferber.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those kind words, and thank you and the committee, the Friends, for all they do for the library and making this community resource possible. And thank you all for coming out on a kind of a hot, humid day to talk about a topic that isn't exactly a happy one. And it's one that causes me discomfort as well, because I think that politics is important. I think that it's how we govern ourselves, and we're not doing such a good job of it. But before we get to that, I have to dispel a couple of rumors. First, contrary to what some people may have thought, we're not talking about island politics here. Perhaps another lecture, but not today. Also, this is not a 2-part series with the circus coming next week, and I'll avoid talking about clowns. And what else was I going to dispel? You like my professor outfit? I put that on today, just so there was a dispute in the family of whether I should wear a tie. There's the tie. Some of you may have been with me a couple of years ago when we talked about some aspects of this topic. And at that point, I said that I was quite happy to be talking to a crowd where the average age is about the same as me, because we can remember a lot of the same things. And I asked you to look back to your childhood and your attitude toward politics back then, or the attitude of your parents back then. And it wasn't such a negative time. Not that people loved politics back then, but our distrust, our disgust wasn't of the levels that it has become today. And this is an outgrowth of that, focusing on a particular part of it, the politics of how we have become so polarized and lack of trust in just about everything. Let me see if I can hit the right button without my glasses. No, that was the wrong button. Where's the right button? Okay, maybe I should have my glasses handy. I have to give credit for a moment to my employer. And this picture also serves as a good reminder of what you're all missing. It's 30 degrees in Rochester today with intermittent sleet and snow showers. Let's all go back quickly. Okay, clearly you don't need me to know that we are living in polarizing times. By the numbers, our current president is the most polarizing one ever. He followed by the numbers the second most polarizing president ever. And in the 2016, the opponent, Hillary Clinton, was also a very polarizing candidate, again by the numbers. We also are now in the strange situation of having a president who has been impeached but not removed from office, and this will set up the first time an impeached president is running for re-election. Over the years, we have suffered a loss of trust in just about everything, all branches of government, certainly of the media, which I think had a high point back in the Watergate years and has been losing trust since then. But above all, we've seemed to have lost trust in each other, in our fellow citizens, especially for those who we disagree with on the other side of us from issues. Once upon a time, we looked upon them as our fellow citizens who happened to be wrong, and now we try to look upon them as the enemy who cannot be trusted. And we basically lost trust in everything. And it does create a vicious circle, because trust is not only based on not lying. That's part of it. And it's not only based on not stealing That's part of it. But it's also trust and confidence is in the ability of the government to get things done, to address issues that we think are problems and importance, come up with some resolution. The lack of trust and the polarization has led to rigid positions, lack of compromise, and as it says there, deadlock and drift, and the inability to address things that are kind of concern to us leads to even less confidence. Just quickly to talk about trust, here's a simple chart that shows quite a lot. Back in 1958, when political scientists first started to ask this question, vast majority of people trusted the government to do what is right most of the time or just about always. And now it tracks down to where, at the last point on this chart, 2017, down to 18%, and you can guess where the blue line has gone since then, and we now hover below 20%. Of course, this tracked Democrats being blue, Republicans being red. It tracked according to whether your party's president, your party had the presidency. But the general shift has been the same. You can see in the late 60s and 70s, that's Vietnam and Watergate. Trust takes the nosedive. It holds, doesn't revive during President Carter's term of office. Ronald Reagan got it back up fairly well for the Republicans, but it didn't last. And you can see the spike at 2001, 9/11. I think that spike is more about patriotism than trust, but it doesn't last either, and it heads down. And although this chart doesn't go beyond into the present, you could expect the blue line to head toward the bottom, and the red line, if you look at the figure of 18%, it hasn't come back up that high either for the average. Today's talk is not about President Trump, but it is important to address a couple of things. And first, it is totally unfair to blame him for the decline in trust. As you saw by the chart, it started a long time before he ever thought about running for office. The lack of trust in the media has been going on for a long time before he started to criticize it for its fake news. In fact, I don't think he's the cause of the lack of trust as much as his candidacy was a reaction to it. He built on the mistrust and the division rather shrewdly. It helped him to win the election. And he now conducts the presidency in a way that does seem to cast distrust on anything that's not on his side. Including statements and tweets, sometimes true, sometimes of questionable validity, and sometimes probably flat out false. Again, this isn't about President Trump, but I think I'm stating the obvious that he is in my time of following politics, which goes back to Eisenhower, and in terms of professionally following it, goes back to Nixon. President Trump has shown less interest in uniting the nation than any president I've known. Maybe the others were better at faking it. He didn't really care. But in fact, Nixon, if you recall, in 1968, his slogan was "Bring us together." And that was the theme that presidents usually try to emphasize. And President Trump's strategy doesn't seem to support that. Now, in terms of politics, it was a smart strategy to help him win the election in 2016. But I think then some people hoped that he would pivot, as they say, and try to be more of an inclusive president, and that doesn't seem to have happened. But he didn't start it, and to blame him for it misdiagnoses why it's going on. And also, if you can't accurately diagnose why it's going on, you can't really come to a very good conclusion. Causes that we'll be talking about today include shifts in the ideological stances of the political parties and their supporters. We now have very little room for moderates in either party. That has made it difficult to reach across the aisle and come to any kind of compromise. And here's one thing that will color our everything we're saying today. Remember this: ideologues are more passionate than moderates. They always are, and that's okay, but it does explain a lot of their behavior. Moderates are more kind of, well, we'd like things to work. Ideologues are more, we want it our way. and they're not interested in compromising, whereas moderates are more likely to ask the question, well, will this make things work? Can we find a way? That's not the tactic of most of your people who are more ideological. Now, I'm not against, by the way, I'm not against standing for something. I think it's important to stand for something. But it's also important to understand that it's a big country, and to get things done, we may have to compromise a tad here and there to come up with a solution that we all can live with. That's what we seem to have trouble doing these days. After talking about parties again, we'll talk about how changes in communication technology, the rise of cable TV, the internet, and so forth, and the way that we absorb that news has changed our attitudes. And wrapping up with interest group activity, there's more of it. Hey, interest groups push us to the parts, they don't bring us to the whole. The increased negative campaigning, hey, you're wondering why we have no trust in politics. And other structural factors, gerrymandering is something we may be able to get to that I think pushes the polarization. Let's talk about party. I didn't think I was going to talk about George Wallace today, but I managed to work him in. Those of you who remember the 1968 campaign, you might recall he was fond of saying there's not a dime's worth of difference between the political parties. That was right before he would criticize the pointy-head intellectuals such as me. Well, he wasn't entirely right that there wasn't a dime's worth of difference, but there was some truth to it that the parties back then had far more ideological overlap and lack of consistency compared to what they have today. The Republicans had a very vibrant liberal wing. Many of you probably have roots in New York. You remember Nelson Rockefeller and Jacob Javits and even Ken Keating of Rochester, and George Pataki, if you want to even go a little further in time, would have a hard time being in where the Republican Party is today. And it wasn't just New York. You had Chuck Percy in Illinois would be one, and Clifford Case of New Jersey, and Mitt's father, George, in Michigan. And you had Barry Goldwater, and you also had a conservative wing, but you also leavened that with a liberal side of Republicans that over the years fell by the wayside. And the Democrats, for their part, they had conservatives largely from the South. Sam Nunn of Georgia, Fritz Howling of South Carolina would be another one, that were fairly conservative on many issues, but they found a place in the Democratic Party. That is largely gone. And so in the contrast to the past, where you had more moderates in each party and an ability to reach across the aisle because you'd find somebody over there who thought kind of fairly similar to what you do, we don't see that today. In some ways, this is the classic watch out because you might get what you asked for. Because George Wallace wasn't the only one. Other people claimed about Tweedledee and Tweedledum, there's no difference, they don't stand for anything. Well, now they do. But we're also now more polarized, and we're not as happy about that either. A quick look at one more data-driven slide. This tries to, this is the result of asking people a series of 10 questions to try to measure their ideology. And you can see the light blue is people who answered consistently liberal, the red or rust is people consistently conservative, and the dark blue is people whose answers to their 10 questions overlapped. You can see that from 1994 to 2004, the dark blue has been shrinking, and the median Democrat and Republican positions, which used to be fairly close, is now widened. And for better or worse, this is where we have gotten to. The moderates, people with the weaker party ties, have drifted toward considering themselves as independents. Although, to be clear, most independents lean toward one party or the other and rather consistently vote for candidates on one side or the other. The remaining party members tend to be the more strong Democrats or strong Republicans and have tended to be the more ideological of that is then compounded in this primary or any primary season, because primary participation is always a slice of the whole party, and who turns out? The most committed people turn out. And those people tend to be the most on the left for the Democrats or right for the Republicans. And in Iowa, and I'm not going to try to explain the whole caucus, but the caucus procedure, because it requires you to give up an evening, to be free that evening, find someone to take care of your kids, be willing to spend the whole night in a gymnasium, it it limits participation because of the barriers to get there and do it. So who has the gumption to overcome those barriers? The really passionate. It makes sense in a way, but it also colors the result that you're going to get out of it. And again, ideologues are simply more passionate. They also tend to believe more in conspiracy theories. Not that every ideological person does, but if you look, and we'll talk about conspiracy theories in a moment, if you look at, and they don't follow liberal or conservative, but they do follow the people who are more committed are more likely to be people who believe in them. Well, let's move off of politics, well, not politics, but political parties and so forth, and get to some of the changes in communication technology. Back in the 1970s, AM radio was in a crisis because FM radio had come along, had been developed, and it had superior sound quality, so music was deserting AM to go over to the FM. And that left AM owners with a big problem. We had a lot of airtime, and we didn't know what to do with it. And you don't make money with dead air. And so maybe because of a political motivation to get involved in political-oriented programming, or maybe simply because of a need to stay in business and get some audience and some advertising that goes with it, many stations turned to an all-talk format at that time. Some went to all news. You might remember all news. That made sense back in the pre-internet days. Now you can go on the internet anytime you want and get news, but back then you couldn't. So a station that only broadcast news had a reason for people to go listen. And others went to talk radio, where you have a host and a guest or two and call-ins from people. And those of you who have listened to it know that the overall tone is to be supportive of the home team, but occasionally critical of them when they do something wrong, and to treat the other side as the evil enemy. Well, I'm talking about sports radio here. I'm not even talking about political radio, because they really follow the same format, right? Think of it. If you ever listen to sports radio, they'll go on and on and on. They're in favor of the home team, but the people will call in for an hour and a half and discuss why did they go for it on fourth down. They should have known it wouldn't have worked. They should have punted. So it's not that they won't be critical of the home team, but they're very in their corner. And it's essentially the same way that political talk radio works as well. I've done a bit of political talk radio myself, usually on the NPR station, not on the more politically one-sided ones. It's kind of interesting in a couple of ways that talk radio never really transferred to television very well. C-SPAN tries it every now and then, they do, but not a lot of people watch C-SPAN, and one reason is because it's not very exciting. And the problem with call-in talk radio on television is that while the caller rambles on, the host and the guests have to just sit there and stare at the camera. They can't do anything else. And it's boring for television. Television needs movement and action, and just staring at the camera doesn't work well. And it also, as an infrequent guest on talk radio, I could let you in that occasionally when this is radio, when the caller is calling in and rambling on, people there, we can make faces to each other in the studio when there's no camera there, and there's television, just gotta sit and stare. So it never really, for better or worse, it never really transferred very well to television. It also has wound up being a fairly one-sided in the ideology. It's dominated by conservatives. Liberals apparently never really got into talk radio. There was the limited attempt, as I show there, of Air America, Al Franken and others that got some audience and limped along for 5 or so years back in the previous decade. But while liberals would take to the internet very quickly and faster than conservatives, who did catch up, liberals never seemed to want to be involved in talk radio. And so, and there was another, you could throw in another fact too, the people who felt that the regular media of that time was liberal biased. They found a nice outlet in conservative talk radio. Here's someone who's talking my language rather than the liberal trash that we get from the networks and everybody else that we don't like. And so it really did develop as a conservative mechanism and still is. And President Trump has been quite shrewd about fostering the connection between himself and his administration, offering people to do interviews and so forth on talk radio, because it is a way that he can have a quick channel to people who are likely to support him. Some would even go as far as saying that talk radio over the years prepared a good constituency for Donald Trump, and some would even say that sometimes he kind of like appears to be a conservative talk radio host in the way he speaks, as more so than a Hollywood image of a president would be. After talk radio got its start, we then come to cable TV and the point of view or partisan-oriented stations that many of us probably watch. There's nothing wrong with watching them as long as you know what you're getting. Media had historically practiced objective journalism, the idea of telling both sides, being fair and so forth. That somewhat fell by the wayside for a couple of reasons. One was the removal of the fairness doctrine, which the federal government had imposed on commercial TV and radio stations that required them to present balanced political programming as a condition of getting or keeping their license. That was removed in 1987. That opened the door for both TV as well as talk radio. Not so much cable, actually, because cable doesn't need a license. Broadcast TV does. But the other thing that fueled it, again, similar to AM radio in a way, cable now had umpteen channels, and we needed to put something on them. And so people figured that, well, if we have a partisan-oriented television network, that will not necessarily get to the widest possible audience because half of the people won't want to watch us, but the other half might be extremely dedicated. And so essentially that's their commercial model. They slant it to appeal to people who are inclined to believe that way in the first place, and they essentially write off the rest of the other side as commercially useless and rarely mention them even, except to ridicule them on occasion, the evil other team that we can't trust. I put up Fox and MSNBC as examples of this, are probably the most prominent, but you get this in other places on cable as well. And this has allowed us to, well, then we go, the same phenomena really, but in another way, the social media bubble. Now, one thing we know is that people on social media tend to hang out with people who are similar to them, cultural values, political values. It's not always that way, but that is the tendency. And so people who are of a similar mind hang out together, they share news stories, retweet things, share things, and so forth. And all this is a steady stream of stuff that reinforces the particular viewpoint of that particular group. Or if you don't want to rely on stories being sent to you by your friends, you, as I understand it, can set up your accounts so only certain stories are sent to you from certain sources. And this is part of the new ability to essentially limit exposure to information that we don't want to hear, that might contradict our current point of view. Again, you can watch the cable outlets that tell you what you want to hear. You can use the social media to bring you news and opinions that you want to hear. This is one thing that has, I'm sure all of you remember reading newspapers, probably some of you still do. The beauty of reading newspapers, and I can read newspapers online, I do that myself, but the beauty of when you were paging through, nobody would read every article, but you would come to things that you probably weren't interested in, but well, that looks a little bit interesting, and suddenly I'd be reading about an archaeology expedition in Greece or something. So I learned something by doing it because I just ran across things that I'm not necessarily interested in. Now, if you set up your social media account to only get news about sports, or whatever, then you're only going to get exposed to that. You're not going to get a broadening effect that media in a different form used to be better at engaging us in. So now we get information that kind of reinforces what we want to hear in the first place. And we get a lot of misinformation. The sad fact of the matter is that fiction spreads faster than truth on the internet. There are reasons why. But if you want to find information that validates what you believe in the first place, you can orient it toward that, even if that information is not necessarily true. There's the increasing use of doctored images, which I have put one up there. This is sometimes the doctored images are so doctored that it's obvious to anybody that it's not real, but sometimes they're cleverly done. This is the one that on one side shows the real photo of President Obama shaking hands with the Indian Prime Minister, and on the other is the fake photo of him shaking hands with the Iranian president, a person that he actually never met. But that photo exists, it's on the internet, it has been used in political campaigns, it's been in some cases put out by a candidate, in other cases put out by groups that support a candidate, and it's not real. But what we are also seeing is that some people don't care that it's not real, because Obama was not good, he was too close to the Iranians, that bad nuclear deal and so forth, so it just reinforces what we knew anyway, and so the fact that it's fake doesn't matter to some people. To me, it does. Before we leave, well, let's see. I don't know what comes next. Here we go. Two more on the media before we go. Look, sensationalism sells, and it always has sold, whether you're talking about newspapers or TV, cable, radio, or now in the internet world, whether you're measured that by circulation of a newspaper, the ratings of radio, TV stations, or the hits that are now being accumulated on the internet. Sensationalism draws the market. If it's in many cases, a for-profit business. It needs an audience to stay in business, and you get an audience in certain ways. And the old media, such as television, my cynical view, they tended to focus on crime, car crashes, scandals, and so forth, with the old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. The new media seems to stay away from car crashes, but is better on conspiracy theories and, to lighten the mix, cat videos, but it's all about getting hits. And you can use the Iowa caucus debacle as an example. Okay, it is a debacle. But there is really, to my knowledge, no evidence that it was deliberately rigged or tampered with. But there are stories flying out around the internet now that there are some started by the Republicans, who traditionally, both parties like to make trouble for the other party. There's some hint of rigging even by Democratic candidates. There's no evidence that it was rigged. It seems to be more technological incompetence. But a story that is tweeted out or put out on the internet about how it doesn't look like it's rigged versus a story that says, oh yes, it was rigged. Well, which one's going to get retweeted and reshared more? The boring story about how it was just stupidity, or the one that there's something evil behind it? You'll get far more traffic on that. Traffic's the name of the game, and that's why truth doesn't travel as fast as fiction on the internet. Now, before we do leave the media, this is the one I thought we were coming to. Let's just think for a minute, since this term is running around, of fake news. And I have to remind my students when they think that fake news is new. Yellow journalism, it goes back to the Spanish-American War over 100 years ago. The idea that all news is not true is not exactly something that just happened in your last 18 years. But the term fake news is now quite common. So really think about it. And I'm not sure of the answer here, but I got some speculations. What is fake news? Well, some people say it's, including it seems the way the president uses, it's news that I disagree with. Anything that I don't like is fake. I don't agree with that definition. I'm more of a stickler for the dictionary, and I'd go to the second possibility. Fabricated stories that have no basis in fact are fake. Like the one that went around the internet. Remember Pizzagate, that alleged that Democratic operatives were running a child sex ring out of a basement of a pizza shop on Connecticut Avenue in Washington. And that would have lingered in the internet world without a lot of publicity until the guy with the rifle from North Carolina who believed it showed up at the pizza parlor to liberate the children. Shots were fired. Nobody got hurt, fortunately, and no children were found. That's a fake news story. Well, how about a story that is true, but ridiculously blown out of what any reasonable person would think is the right proportion? It happened, it's true, but it's being emphasized to the degree that, geez, why are we making such a big deal about this? The eating habits of candidates. Like the time President Trump had a picture of him eating fast food with a knife and fork. And everybody got really blown. I thought those may need to be cut. What difference does it make? It did happen. I mean, there was a picture of it. So it's not fake in the sense that it's totally fabricated, but why are we making such a big deal about this? And it happens to other candidates too when they put ketchup on the wrong thing. You know, they're like if we had a candidate in Philadelphia or one up the island here who put ketchup on their cheesesteak. You never use ketchup. Okay, it really did happen, but why are we making such a big deal when there's probably things ton more important that we ought to be covering? Well, they're not as exciting. It might be the answer. And then you get into stories that are partially true, but maybe some elements of it are not true. And if you want to discredit the story, you can focus on the untrue and call it fake, even though most of the story was true, did happen. Is that fake? Or how about my last choice, and this is what I think that the MSNBC and Fox people do all the time. The stories that are true really did happen, but they leave out critical elements so as to spin it to their particular ideological crowd. They're not lying. The story did happen, but they're leaving out enough. You can do this at home too. I did this once. I did it more often than once. If a big story happens, and watch Fox or NBC for a little while, and then flip to the other one to see what they're saying. They'll probably be talking about the same topic, but the way that they're reporting it, the aspects of the story, the significance they're assigning to it will be like worlds apart. So which one is fake? Neither. Which one's lying? Neither. Which one's telling the whole story? Neither again. One time I did that when I think even before President Trump took office, he alleged without any proof that President Obama had ordered the Trump Tower bugged. Well, you turn on NBC, they're livid. This is all charges being thrown around without any basis in fact. This is nouveau McCarthyism. You switch to Fox, they're talking about it too, but kind of saying, in the past, some stories have come up that weren't immediately supported by facts, but did turn out to be true. So maybe this could be one of them too. And they're right. You can find stories in the past that initially started as a rumor or whatever without any facts and did turn out to actually be true. So they weren't lying either. But the tone or spin or whatever you want to call it that you will get on is vastly different. So does that make it fake? Well, I think we have to go beyond the dictionary of fake and consider the intent. What is the intent behind this? Is what you're seeing an honest attempt to tell basically the full story and all the relevant facts, or is it intended to deliberately mislead people? Stories that are true but leave out critical elements, I think, are deceptive. And so, okay, even though they're not fake because it was a true story, they are fake because they're trying to deliberately mislead people. So I think that I'd have to violate the dictionary and apply fake to that. And I threw on there, newsflash, all media is biased. If you can go out and find the outlet that is not biased, let me know and I'll add it to the slide here. But no media outlet can cover everything in the world. You wouldn't have time to absorb it if they did. And so every media outlet has got to pick and choose what you're going to cover. You're going to cover a lot, a little, or not at all. That's a choice. That's even before you've reported a word about it, that's a choice. And that choice, that's where bias can start to creep in. And then how you report it, what you emphasize, don't emphasize, your interpretation, and so forth, that also can introduce bias. I think it's impossible to totally eliminate it. Some outlets can do a better job of trying to keep it in check, knowing that they could be biased, to try to encourage their reporters, their staff, their editors to fight against it, and others are just flat out the door, let's be biased. That's our commercial basis. I have one other, reminds me of one other cable news story, which I think is illustrative. It happened to me. It happened when President Obama was running for re-election and opposed by Romney. And if you recall, in the first debate, Romney did quite well. And Obama was kind of lackluster. Not terrible, but kind of lackluster. And Romney looked very good that night. And in these debates, always, not just that one, if the challenger looks as good as the incumbent president, the challenger has won. Because the president's supposed to look better. So just doing as well as the incumbent, that was a great night for Romney. And so I had Fox on there, of course, saying that Romney did such a great idea and so forth. And I agreed. He had looked very good. I gave him credit for that. And then I was going to flip to NBC, where I anticipated that they would be desperately trying to squeeze the lemon for as much lemonade as they could get out of this, and coming up with, mealy mouth. Well, it was a bit of an off night, but he did pretty well. So I flipped the channel. I was totally wrong. This is a bit, I don't have many epiphanies, but this was like one of them. They were flat out mad at Obama. Obama had let them down. I mean, they did not whitewash his bad performance or his mediocre performance. I mean, that was front and center, that he had done a bad job and he was capable of doing better, and why hadn't he? And how can you do this to us? We're your supporters. And so it's not that, again, it's like going back to the talk radio format. It's not like the home team never gets criticized. Under certain circumstances, you do come in for criticism. But in this case, again, it's that you didn't do a good enough job for us and win the game. Well, let's move off news to a couple of other things here. By any measure, whether it's the number of groups in the phone book or on the internet or registered lobbyists or the amount of money they spend or whatever way you want to measure it, interest group activity has just skyrocketed over the last decades. Favorite little statistic I have there up, I love it because it shows everything. In our state capital of Albany, back in 1978, there were 941 registered lobbyists. By 2004, there's 3,842 running around the building. It would come out to a ratio of 18 lobbyists for every single member of the state legislature. It's probably higher than it was back then, and it's because lobbying works. Interest groups aren't all bad, by the way. I mean, they do get something of a negative rap, but people should be members of interest groups. It's a way to advance your interests. I mean, how many AARP members do we have here in the audience? What about Dunkin' Donuts taking away the free donut? I didn't like that very much, but it didn't stop me from being a member. So my interests get advanced. And so that's not wrong. But what happens is that interest groups are in the business, it's why they're there, of pushing for their interest. They might try to dress it up in being for the public interest and the common good, but primarily they're there for their interest. That's why we give them money, and that's why they hire lobbyists and so forth. They not really wanting to compromise. They may have to if they can't get 100%, but what they shoot for is 100% of their part. No interest group pushes for the collective center. There is no interest group that does that. Name me one. There is none. They all push for their part, which up to a level is a good thing. But on the other hand, if you want to talk about why we're so polarized, we have all these forces pulling us to our respective corners. And at the same time that we've seen interest groups rise in their number, their importance, their influence, we've seen political parties become an even better bad guy than the interest groups were. We have people tolerating them as necessary evils. We have people deciding to be independents rather than partisans. Political parties were never perfect, and they had a lot of problems. But one thing that they did do, which we seen, and why it's relevant here, is that by their very nature in a two-party system, they wanted to get as many people into their side as they could, because you get more people on your side than the other, then you win. So we pull as many in as we can, and they're trying to do the same thing. And they were trying to do the same thing with interest groups. Two big tents. We want you in our tent, but you have to cooperate with the other people in our tent. So interest groups, sure, come on in, but be willing to make a deal with other interest groups that are in here already. Well, the tents have kind of collapsed. And not entirely, but the tents have kind of collapsed and have turned interest groups into like free agents who are now out for themselves, and they don't have that compromising incentive. If you want to play in the Democratic Party, or the Republicans did the same thing, sure, we'll welcome you, but you got to play in here. That I won't say is totally gone, but I think that it has diminished, and it hasn't. If you're looking for why we're polarized, take a look at that. And I'll throw on one other nice thing to say about parties. We often at election time we lament how so few people are turning out to vote. Well, Political parties were an institution, an organization, part of which was designed to pull people out to vote, to get them to the polls, of course, vote for our side, but to encourage participation. And we have devilized that mechanism, and now we lament low voting turnout. There's more reasons why. There's plenty of reasons why. It's not the only one, but it was an institution that made an effort to get people to vote, and we've somewhat, fairly lost that, not entirely, but fairly. Everybody's favorite, negative ads. Again, I have to remind my students that, well, mudslinging is a term that goes back before TV. It's not that this just started recently, and we've had negative ads. I mean, you can go back to the tapes and look at the negative ads of Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower. There were some negative ads back then. But not all negative ads are necessarily wrong. In my view, if a negative ad, an ad that is critical of my opponent, but if that fairly characterizes their position and mine, which is different, and of course I'm paying to put the ad on because I think you'll agree with me, but if I fairly have characterized the opponent and myself, then what's wrong with that? That's a contrast. It gives you a basis to make a choice. That's not the problem. The problem is the ones that simply attack people's character or drag up third grade incidents. The whole, you've seen too many of them, the grainy footage, slow motion, the ominous voice, the threatening music. And so-and-so cheated in the third grade. We can't trust so-and-so in Congress. The whole idea is trust. And if the ad sows distrust into you, in your opinion of that other candidate, that's all it needs to do. And now we have so many more negative ads, and so many that are focusing on that as opposed to any kind of issue differences. They're focusing on that. Many of them are not put on by the campaign itself. They're put on by the independent groups that are supposedly uncoordinated with the campaign, which can largely spend as much money as they want to do this. And of course, they encourage people to view the object of the negative ad as the untrustworthy enemy. Well, after a steady diet of these year after year, decade after decade, we don't trust anybody anymore, because what's the lesson of negative ads? They're all untrustworthy cumulatively. And so they're very corrosive. In this fashion, they're very corrosive, and we have more of them than we used to have. And the other problem, or the related problem, is the big money that is pushing them, which brings me to a moment of Citizen United. People think of Citizen United as a conservative thing because Citizen United was a conservative group that brought the lawsuit. So the victory was for them. And it was a victory for them, but what it did was open the door to unregulated spending. And guess what? Wealthy liberal interests are smart enough to walk through the door, just like wealthy conservative interests. And so it has unleashed big money, and largely untrackable money, because a lot of these donors hide behind front PACs that might have a website and a name like Citizens for Responsible Government. Well, who funded the Citizens for Responsible Government? Can't tell. And this has just led to an almost unlimited amount of unknown money, generally, not always, but generally pushing negativity into the campaigns. I did want to get to this structural issue here. Gerrymandering is not the cause of all this, but it does contribute. It's certainly not the cause of all this, because it goes back to the 1950s when I was a kid, and earlier than that. It goes back to the country's origin, actually. And it only affects, in national politics, it only affects the House, because we don't gerrymander Senate seats, except when West Virginia got out of Virginia. But other than that, we don't change the state lines. But what gerrymandering does do is deliberately produce House or state legislature districts that are one-sided, lopsided for one party against the other. And to be fair, there are certain districts across the United States that wind up that way anyway, because a lot of people from one party live in that section of the state or that state. So not all lopsided districts are the result of deliberate gerrymandering, but many of them are. Well, what happens then is that the incumbent of the dominant party knows that it's virtually impossible to lose to the other party, barring a scandal or some idiotic move on their part. You can't lose the other party, but there is a way to lose, and that is in a primary in your own party, And so for the Republican, that means getting as conservative as you can, go far right or now far Trump, because the last thing you want to do is face a primary with Donald Trump endorsing your opponent. And that's how you're going to get defeated. So the way to inoculate against that is don't get anywhere near the center, get all the way over there, and don't compromise with the other side either, because that's dealing with the enemy. And that will be criticized in a primary campaign. The liberals do the same thing, or the Democrats, the liberals do the same thing. The one way to avoid a primary is to get really liberal and not get out-liberaled in the next, if a primary comes up. So it pushes people to the extremes. It does not push them toward the center. So it's another reason of polarization. There are efforts through the courts. There are also efforts in some states to take redistricting out of the hands of the state legislature, who are the most interested parties on earth, and turn it over to some kind of bipartisan, nonpartisan commission. I'm not naive enough to think that anything is nonpartisan when we're talking about this, but you can insulate the redistricting process from the legislative process, which some states have done that. Virginia is talking about doing it right now. I think it's a great thing that we ought to do. It's a great thing in part because it doesn't particularly benefit one party or the other. Well, it does in a given year. If you're the party in charge of the legislature in the year you do redistricting, you can use it to screw the other party. But over time, both parties might be in charge in the annual redistricting in given years. So it's not one that fundamentally helps the Democrats or fundamentally helps Republicans. So you might get some ability to get people to do this, and I think it won't solve the polarization, but it would reduce one factor that is pushing us toward it. Oh, well, now the optimistic slide, what can be done? Stop gerrymandering is one thing that can be done. But I have here data from a recent study by the Pew Foundation where people optimistically said it was possible to improve confidence in the federal government and also possible to improve confidence in each other. Okay, I like that. Now, how are we going to do it? Well, these are ideas here from that survey. This is what people responded. Muffled political partisanship and group-centered tribalism. Yeah, fine. But, how are we going to do that? How are we going to, by the way, since we're on the word partisanship, I just have to say one word about that. It oftentimes is looked upon as kind of a negative, dirty word. And I like to distinguish between good partisanship and bad partisanship. Good partisanship is standing for something and willing to fight for it. Bad partisanship is the strategic, tactical part about how well, that's a good idea, but they said it, and we can't let them win because they'll take credit for it, and that'll help them in their next election. So it's a good idea. We're against it, even though we think it's a good idea. Not now, because it came from the other side. That's where partisanship runs off the rails, if you ask me. I don't have a problem with people standing for something. I do hope that, again, they can have some degree of compromise on. Some issues are easier to compromise on than others. That's true too. But we don't seem to compromise very well on anything these days. And we've always had the bad partisanship. But I just think partisanship is not entirely a bad word. Okay, the next one. Refocus news away from insult-ridden talk shows and sensationalism. Okay, change your channel. The reason why insult-ridden talk shows are on the air is because people watch them. And if they didn't watch them, they would go away, because the businesses that own TV stations are not dumb. They put them on because it attracts ratings. And so, in part, the problem is us. I guess the next one is reduce attention to digital screens. Maybe that means get away from social media, spend more time. Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah. Just at lunch today, we had me with my computer at the lunch table because I thought a question might come up here that I hadn't know the answer to, so I had an excuse. And practice empathy. Okay, I'm in favor of that too, but maybe that leads to the ones that I come up with now, the last four. Show some respect for people that you disagree with. There's more that unites us in this country than divides us. But we focus on what divides us. The media focus on what divides us. Okay, some things should divide us. Again, different people, different groups, parties can stand for different things. Politics should be a way to hash that out. But hash that out includes having some respect for the other side and understanding why they feel that way. I don't agree with it, but I understand why you could feel that way. You're not an evil. It depends, of course, on the issue. But in most cases, if you're advocating segregation, I guess I might have to finally say you're an evil person. But in most cases, you're someone I disagree with, maybe profoundly disagree with, but you're not an evil person. In terms of the news, I don't think that we're going to stop watching our favorite cable outlets, but understand what you're getting and what you're not getting. You're getting tailor-made news designed to reinforce your opinion. Yeah, it's entertaining, it might be informative, but remember that there's a limit to what you're getting there, and there are other sides of the story. And then the last two that I have here, I already talked about stop gerrymandering districts, and campaign finance, that's a whole lecture in itself. I would simply argue here that the actual funding source for ads must be evident and discoverable. Take ownership for what you put out, which now you can evade very easily. Take ownership. And I think that would reduce some of the outrageous negativity. If it was actually going to be tied to you, you might not want your name associated with it. So, and again, I think that is a possible improvement because it doesn't necessarily benefit Democrats or Republicans. It's kind of partisan neutral. Both sides would have to reveal their funding sources in a way that honest people could honestly find. So there's a couple of moves that I would suggest could be made. I picked, again, the last two I picked, I focus on them because if either side sees it as giving the other side a tactical advantage, it's going to be harder to sell. If they see it as relatively neutral and neither hurts nor helps either side more so than the other, well, maybe we could talk about that. So, I hate to stop this on a negative feeling. I think there are things that we could do. I think there are things that we can do as individuals, but frankly, the answer to this lies more with the people who aren't in this room other than my niece. We're not going to influence that many more presidential elections. But people who are 20 years old, 30 years old, and so forth, they have a lot more at stake in this. They are the ones that are going to have to see whether they want to go down this road or change it, or whether they're going to what degree they're going to use social media in their relationship and their news consumption. I hope that they can see, and I don't think they're going to give up the internet. I don't want them to give up the internet, but I hope they can see how certain behaviors lead to certain things, and they might think about what world they want to live in because they got a lot more at stake than people of my age do. Not that I don't care, but the fact of the matter is I'm not going to vote in that many more elections than they are. So go talk to your grandchildren and see what you can do. Thank you very much. And don't forget to vote. And now we can take some questions. Yes, sir.
You showed a slide that said in the 1950s, 75% trusted institutions of government. Now it's 17%. Is there a correlation between voter turnout and trust in government?
Yes, I think roughly there is. And well, trust has gone down, but it's spiked a little, so I can't say that in those periods where it spiked up a bit, the turnout revived as well, but the general tracking of turnout has been mediocre, of course. The previous midterm election, a year and a half ago, saw unusually high levels for a midterm, so maybe the trend is reversing. But I would think in general, the trend is there. It might not go 1-to-1 over the whole track. Yes?
What do you think is the most unbiased news source?
Is the most unbiased news source? Well, again, they're all biased, but NPR, is a good one. I would recommend occasionally going to BBC, actually, because they have less of a I mean, they have a stake, but they also have less of it than our domestic sources. And also, it's interesting to get a foreign perspective on what we're doing here, just to see a different take on it. But I think the best way is to use a variety of them rather than to rely on one. Real Clear Politics is an internet site that draws from a bunch of different outlets, so you get more of a variety on that one. So that'd be another recommendation. Yes, sir.
In Australia, they have a legal requirement to vote. What's your feelings about that in America?
They do, and I guess you in Australia you get a small penalty. Tax penalty is modest that if you fail to vote, so there is something of a penalty if you disobey the law. Do we really want to force disinterested people who don't pay attention and so forth? Do we really want to force them to go cast a ballot? Yes, it would do well for our votation levels. It would look better on that. Really, people who don't care and just go in and throw a button so they don't avoid the penalty, I don't know that that's really an improvement. So I think there are a lot of reasons why people don't vote, and I'd like to, and to some degree we've been addressing the convenience factor through early voting and easier absentee balloting and so forth. We've been trying to reduce some of those barriers, which is a good thing to do. And I think the biggest factor of why people don't vote is they don't think it makes any difference.
Sitting under signs that don't vote.
Yeah, no, I think people should vote. But I have to tell this story because my wife brought it up to me that at the Iowa, and again, I'm doing something. I just stand still. So you're at the Iowa caucus. Yes. Oh, if the TV is or the monitor is not cooperating or not liking me, very good. I'll just hide here in the corner. So you're at the Iowa caucus, and this tends to be committed people who are willing to spend the evening and so forth. So tends to be you would think, a more informed crowd. And my wife tells me that there was some woman who found out that Mayor Pete is gay and wanted her preference back. Yeah. And now, I'm not saying that's a reason to be for him or against him, not at all. But that little pertinent fact that somehow has escaped your attention throughout the hopefully most people know pertinent facts like that. Yes, sir.
My reading of American history is we have great changes: war, depression. I can say this.
Well, I wouldn't hope for any of them to be the next changer. Yes, but you're right. Times of crisis have produced realignment. They have also at some times brought us together as well, after like the immediate 9/11 period. I think we then drifted apart over the long-running conduct of Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth. But yeah, I mean, it's contextual. Another way that comes to my mind to think about that is that leadership is very contextual. I mean, people don't know what's going to happen. A hurricane can happen and how you respond to it or not. It's thrust upon you. 9/11 can happen. And by all accounts, Mayor Giuliani at that point did a marvelous job in New York of trying to lead it. He didn't know that 9/11 was going to happen, but he responded, rose to the occasion. And so I think crisis does change things sometimes for the better, sometimes not for the better. But it is a factor that's going to happen. Yes?
How long does it take typically for a historical perspective on current politics?
Well, yeah. I'm a political scientist, not a historian, but people will put out analysis very quickly. But I think that individual analysis is less weighty than a consensus of different viewpoints that write or research the same topic and come out over a period of time. So I would, I would think 10 years, my guess is at least 10 years for something to emerge. People put something out right away. Maybe they're right, but maybe subsequently most people will disagree with that analysis too. So I would give it a period. Yes, sir.
So I recently saw that YouTube is going to start monitoring and taking down fake articles. I think I just saw it this last week. They're going to attempt to determine what's fake and what's not. Is that worth the effort?
Well, yeah, it's not. Yes, and Facebook is not, as far as I know, at the moment. They have resisted doing that. Of course, it does open up questions of censorship, and I understand why that's a tricky area that they wouldn't want to be in. But letting knowingly false stuff stay there, I think, is counterproductive. And will it be a perfect effort? No, I don't think they can 100% police it. But I do think that stuff that is just factually incorrect ought not to be able to be transmitted worldwide forever. Yes, sir.
What about routers and Associated Press as a source of news? The news services, Associated Press and routers, is there a way you can go to them directly and get the news, or you just have to wait till it comes out on the media?
I actually don't know. I think that they probably, like most Main Street outlets, are not as robust as they once were, but I don't really know if they have a direct.
They have an app.
Yeah. Okay. I would not surprised that they do. Way in the back.
I have a question about your final comment about the future. Our young people. I'm a retired educator. My disclaimer is that I've earned my degrees in the flyover states, and so we were always taught that your students should never know what your political beliefs are. They should never know them. So my question is, what do you think the role of our educational institutions could or should be in the education of our future voters, starting very young in the areas of political science, government, and policy?
Well, there's a couple parts of that. First of all, I agree that, and I've tried during my career, and I have some colleagues that don't do it this way, but to try to not take a partisan position, I argue that my job is to make students think, but not to tell them what to think. There are certain colleagues in the discipline that wear their ID on their sleeve, which to some degree is okay if you, I wouldn't do it that way. It's okay, at least at the college level, it's okay as long as you don't intimidate people who disagree from expressing themselves. And that's a tricky one, to be able to do that. I think it's possible, but I think there's subtleness in that. But I do think, if you are going to express your political viewpoints, that you ought to make it clear that you're not the only voice in the room and other people ought to disagree with you. Our education in civics has gone downhill over the past 40 years or so. I feel kind of like a professional failure because I've been trying to talk about this stuff for 40 years, and maybe I got through to some of my students. I'd like to think so, but I see the general interest in civics, or the effects of lack of civics, pervading across the society, and I wonder what me and my colleagues have been doing. Have we been that ineffective? I think politics, a lot of people don't like politics, and politics can be rough, and it can occasionally be dirty and illegal. But, at its best, people ought to fight for things. As I tried one time to reach a sports kid in my class, when your team goes out on the field on Sunday, you expect them to fight hard, don't you? Right. And people who believe in certain political ideals, they ought to go out there and fight hard too. But we ought to have a fair fight, and we ought to have respect for the opponent, I think, too. But there's nothing wrong with fighting hard. And that is how we're a very diverse society. We have a lot of different viewpoints on a lot of stuff. We have to have a process where we can meld it all. And the process is not working as well as it was never perfect, but it's not working as well as it once did. And that bothers me. Yes?
Where is media literacy being taught?
that term does show up. So if students took a communications course, I suspect that could be a specific topic or even a specific course in that department. To what degree it filters, obviously from what I've said to you, it filters into some of the stuff that I would say to students in my course, although it's hardly the focus of it. It's, I guess the people in the English department would tell you, well, where is literacy supposed to be taught? Not just in the English department. It's something that all of us should blend into in different ways, in ways that are relevant to our discipline, because we are supposed to know what we're talking about. But I think it's something that transcends so many parts that it ought to get a focus from a lot of them. Yes.
There's such a power in incumbency, and there's a smattering of talk about term limits. Can you describe what your posture is on that idea and how it might affect our government?
Well, term limits have been proposed and in public opinion would be popular for the Congress, but it would take a constitutional amendment to enact them. And in our degree, I was saying at lunch today, in our degree of polarization, it's impossible to imagine 2/3 of our House and Senate making a constitutional amendment on anything, much as less one that would get them out of their jobs after a fashion. But we have seen term limits imposed in somewhat close to half, but less than half of the states, and also some city commissions or county commissions, county councils, and so forth. I think it's a qualified good idea. I think that when we go back to the founding of our country, the founders never thought that people would do public service for a career. Now, the country changed a lot since then, but I don't think that was their vision. But now it has become a career, and I think that leads to insulation from real life, if you want, and a desperation to keep that job because, well, it's your career. If you knew that this career was going to end at a certain date, you wouldn't be so desperate to keep it because you'd already know you'd have to go on to do something else. The danger of term limits, in some states I think that have done this, is to set them ridiculously low so that you're turned out after 8 years. Well, then we're turning out people who have just figured out how the place works. The leaders are like newbies almost. They've been there 5 years, and I'm a veteran. So I think if you set it something like 12 years, you allow for a better blend of veterans and newcomers. I think that helps the institutional memory of the place. Well, we tried that 8 years ago and it didn't work. Someone should ought to be able to remember that. So I'd say I like term limits, but be careful if you set them too low. And if you set them too low and everybody in the legislature is a newbie, essentially, it also then shifts power to the unelected staff because they just keep there and attached to a new legislator. They know more than the legislator and quite frankly, sometimes they do because they specialize on something, and legislators must be generalists that look at a lot of things. But I think we would increase the staff influence, we'd increase the lobbyist influence. If you're a good lobbyist, you know your subject matter very well. And you would know it much better than a whole bunch of newbie legislators, and it would probably also shift power to the bureaucracy because the civil servants stay for years and years and years, and so it would shift to the executive branch. So you set them too low, and I think it would emasculate the legislative branch in the separation of powers framework. But if you set it with a reasonable amount of time, I think it would be healthy, because I do think it's not that people in the legislature don't pay any attention to the real world. They're not dopes. They have constituents, they want to get reelected, they go home, they talk. But they don't have the real world experience from really living it. If you really want to know how farm regulations affect farming, be a farmer for a while. You really have a good idea, or a small business person or whatever. You really know how government laws and regulations affect people in the real world. And it's not that the veterans in the legislature don't pay any attention or haven't heard of it, but they haven't lived it personally in a long time. And I think that that's beneficial. So again, be careful to set them at a reasonable length, but I think they are a good idea for the country. Nobody wants to ask about Iowa?
I find that the commercial nightly news, ABC,
whereas the cable stations tend to be more ideological. How do you feel about that?
They are short and shallow because they only have 30 minutes. And to cover a bunch of stuff, you can't spend too much time on any one story. So they've always been short and shallow. And the interesting contrast to cable is that cable that does not have a 30-minute limit does the same thing in general. You look at CNN, they just repeat short stories all day long. In theory, they have the time to go in depth on any one of them, but they don't tend to do that. In terms of the objectivity, I think that the network evening news is a better place to find it than other places, but I think that may also be a recognition that their audience is aging, us, and that we expect that more than, that's why we're still going back there. So in some respect, that's their business model, to try to have a credibility image, because that's what attracts some of us to watch them and stay watching them. Yes?
In the 60s, there was a sharper line between news and commentary. And somewhere along the line, we lost that, where it's almost indistinguishable. I mean, we can tell the difference when we see it, but one thing morphs into the other, and they're mixed. I can remember Walter Cronkite, and whatever, saying, at the end of the news broadcast, he'd make an editorial, but he was very clear that this is an editorial, this is a commentary, it's not news.
As newspapers always were, they had an editorial page and they had a news section. And well, we've also blended news and entertainment a whole lot. Frankly, a lot of people now get their entertainment from, the use of Jon Stewart when he was on The Night, and Colbert and so forth. And not all that is wrong. It's not, viewers can learn something about the news, but it's done in a caustic, frivolous almost style. And so we have, but even if you go back to a respected TV program like 60 Minutes, which is a respected news show, but they did like the gotcha moment because it made for good television. And so that was even a bit of entertainment. And that may be one reason why a lot of people watched it. It had great ratings, because it was entertaining, but also it was newsworthy. So for a long time, there hasn't been a total, I don't know, maybe there never was, but for a long time, there hasn't been a total demarcation between the two.
Every time we have a presidential election, there's always talk about whether we should keep the electoral college or not. What is your opinion about that?
A couple things. I'm just going to shut this off. I'm just going to make that go away. Just make that go away. At least I can now lean. It would obviously take a constitutional amendment to make it go away. And again, I can't see our present Congress having a constitutional amendment on anything in the present times. Should it go away? I'm inclined to actually, and I defended it for a long time, but I'm inclined to say yes. First, for several reasons. First, it does go back to the founders, yes, and the founders are sacred, but the Electoral College of today is not what they designed. It's been altered in many ways along the way, so it may have some resemblance to what they wanted, but it's not their design. So long as the Electoral College produced the same result as the popular vote, which for most of our lifetime, all the time it did. And now we've had two examples, George Bush, the first election, and Donald Trump, the second, where it didn't. And it is undermining the faith in democracy, I think. And two, if you go back to our founders, and I spend a lot of time with the founders, and I think that they were a very smart group and did a lot of good, brilliant group. But a lot has changed. They were not exactly abashedly in favor of democracy. They were kind of an elitist crowd. They wanted a system that was responsive to popular sovereignty and ultimately based on it. But if you recall, they didn't allow people to elect senators. They let that be the choice of states until the early 20th century it was. Constitutional Amendment changed that. And the Electoral College was actually a convoluted thing even back then, designed to, because we can't figure out a better way to select the president because, we're not going to let the people vote for it, is one. And two, we're not going to let the Congress select the president because that would violate separation of powers. So we come up with this electoral college thing that was always confusing from the start. But the country in many ways, such as the direct election of senators, the initiatives and referendums on various issues that are allowed in some states but not others, we have moved to far more democratic tendencies and democratic expectations. And so long as the Electoral College didn't contradict the popular vote, so what's an anachronism? But now it has, and I think that it is undermining people's view of democracy. You may be aware, too, of the thing I had to look up at lunch, which is the Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a scheme being promoted by states and would not take a constitutional amendment, which is the real cleverness of this, that states, and 15 states plus Washington, D.C. have joined, and they have pledged that if enough states join to control the Electoral College majority vote, then each of those members of the compact will award their Electoral College votes to the winner of the popular vote. And now at this point, they're still short of enough states to do that, so it's just a thing on paper. It hasn't. Yes, you could. I'm sure people who don't like it would try to challenge it in the court. But the Constitution does give the states the power to choose how they appoint their electors. And that's how actually we got to the popular vote. There's no constitutional amendment for that either, and it wasn't all at once, but one by one. Originally the states would choose the electors without any public participation, but somewhere in the late 19th century or mid 19th century, states one by one decided that, we'll just have a popular vote, and the winner of that will give our electoral votes too. That didn't take a constitutional amendment either. So yes, I'm sure somebody would challenge it if this does take place, but the Constitution does say states shall decide how to, or something like that, shall choose their electors without any specificity. They could roll dice, I guess, under the Constitution. So while I can't see a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College ever passing, this other way, which is a backdoor around it, but I do think that it has some potential of actually happening and then being challenged in court. And as we all know, for the treehouse, that can take a long time. So nobody wants to talk about Iowa. Nobody wants to say, why do we have a caucus? Yes.
The only thing about Iowa that makes me a little nervous is when we do start talking about doing a popular vote, how long will it take us to find a program that actually works?
Well, but we counted the popular vote for years. We just shouldn't use untested apps to do it, apparently. Let me just say a couple things about the caucus, because it is, and why do we have a caucus, and I'm somewhat wondering if we'll have another one 4 years from now. The presidential election and the nomination process, even though it's for a federal office, for the highest office in the land and all that, our elections set up by the founders are on a state-by-state basis. And even when we all vote in November on the same day for presidential candidates, we will be voting in different states with different rules as to how long you had to be registered in advance or not at all, whether you need a photo ID or not, whether you can get an absentee ballot, early voting or not. We also differ on how they purge registration rolls. The feds set certain parameters. 18, blacks got the right to vote, women got the right to vote. States can't go out of that, but they can have leeway within that, and the rules are not all the same in the presidential election. And then you get to the nomination process where it's just, as you can see, a patchwork quilt of different states in no orderly fashion going off on different dates. They do publicize them in advance, but there's no rhyme or reason to it. Some states, a limited number, have this caucus feature. Most have elected to use a primary. The caucus, about a half dozen use it. Iowa gets all the attention because it's first. Nevada will get some too because it's going by itself in the number 4 position in a couple of weeks. It only works in very small states because the idea of, like in California, finding gymnasiums where millions of people could come, it's kind of archaic. It's been criticized for a while of making participation difficult. As I mentioned earlier, you got to give up the whole evening. And so there's been criticism of why do we still have these caucuses before, and now with this counting debacle going on, I think there may be more pressure for the remaining states that use it to just switch to a primary. This wouldn't take a constitutional amendment either. It would take the National Party essentially and the National Party does have certain rules that states must follow, or your delegates won't be seated at the convention, which is kind of a real threat. And so if the National Party wanted to ban caucuses as a way of selecting presidential delegates, they could do that, and I suspect there'll be a lot of talk over the next several years of moving that direction. And we won't have to wait for the results like this. Of course, as we proved in Florida in 2000, we can screw up counting votes in a regular election too, but hopefully that won't happen very often.
So outside of the counting of the votes, what are the positive things about using a caucus to do that process?
It is, in its charming way, it is citizens getting together and not just standing in a line and voting, but actually talking to one another and actually some persuasion going on of, well, come over to our side, your candidate doesn't have enough to qualify for votes, why don't you come over? And Pete seems to have been, or his people seems to have done very well on that. He was the second place choice of a lot of people whose number one choice didn't reach the viability level. So the idea of citizens actually getting together and talking about it and making a decision does have a charm. I just don't think it's very practical in these days. But the results are now coming in, by the way, and they're a few days late and so forth. The results are not, I don't think they're tainted, and I don't think that they are that surprising. I think that Biden didn't do as well as he would have hoped for. He never thought he was going to win Iowa. I don't think he ever thinks he's going to win New Hampshire either. His strategy was to do reasonably well in those two states and then do well in South Carolina and Nevada. And now he's eroded that a bit by not doing as well in Iowa as he had hoped for. Bernie was doing well in all the polls, as was Pete. The fact that Pete did approximately as well as Bernie, that's a good boost for him. Because these early contests are a funnel. No one's talking about Tom Steyer today. They funnel down to the candidates that we'll focus on, and they give certain candidates momentum and take it away from others, momentum in terms of polling, public interest, fundraising, and everything. So, Pete would have to be very happy that he exceeded. He was going to do well, it looked like, and he did even better than that. He has to come out feeling good. Biden probably did not feel very good, and now it's very important to his campaign that he not get clobbered in New Hampshire, but I don't think he thinks he's going to win New Hampshire. That's not the strategy. It's to not look bad, not necessarily to win. But next week we'll have a new story, and all the talk about that sheer technological incompetence in Iowa will fall by the wayside. We'll be focused on something new, and it'll be another asterisk, but one that I do think over the next 4 years will be talked about seriously, whether we really want to repeat anything like that again, because we don't. Okay, no more questions. Thanks so much for your attention. I appreciate your interest in the topic.